Hey everyone, and welcome to my home theatre journey. This is just a look back in time in terms of where it all began and the different sort of stages for my home theatre or home media setups. So it all began basically with a PC setup. And this was the first time I ever experienced a 5.1 sort of setup, and as you can see, it was a tiny little sub and tiny little speakers, but having that separation of all 5 speakers, this was the first time I ever experienced something like that. I mainly just used that particular setup for sports, but even the odd movie here and there was quite a good watch as well. Then I bought my first property back in 2009, and as you can see, I went with two 50-inch plasma TVs. At the time, 50-inch TVs was quite big, but as you can see, depending on which room you're actually looking at and where I've actually placed it, the TV itself didn't actually look that imposing, and it was more so a case of a big TV rather than being a home theatre, if you like. At the time, it was all about aesthetics, so everything was set up in order to have a theme. I did always want the sort of main media setup to be in the center of that particular room, and this is the setup in the opposite room. So because that one was in a corner as opposed to being against a flat wall, even though both of these TVs were the same size, essentially the one in the other room always looked bigger. The way I had it set up was this particular one was used for movies and sports here in this room, and the other one was used for basically the kids' TV and the wife's TV, so they could watch whatever they wanted to in the other room. This whole setup, we were very happy with it. The TVs themselves performed really well. These TVs only recently died 10 years later, or more than 10 years later. They had a good, I'd say maybe 6-7 years of usage before they finally kind of were put to rest because of upgrades. This is sort of the line I went down, where for sports it was more a case of I just wanted as many options as possible, and this particular TV was always linked up to this computer, and it gave me a lot of flexibility in terms of what I wanted to watch. Then I moved out and back in, and at that point I just wanted something bigger, and that's when I went for the 65-inch TCL TV. Now this one, I purchased it because my brother actually had the exact same model in a different country, but as it turned out, the UK, as usual, gets the worst of everything, and the model I got here in the UK was actually inferior. Now initially when I set it up, and even to this day for sports, it is actually reasonably good. Because it's only a 60Hz panel, it's not the best for motion blur, but the bigger panel in comparison to what we were used to with these 50-inch TVs did mean that you had a little bit more immersion. I did add this wider media console, which I always wanted for that wall, just to take up a little bit of extra room and have it really centered, and adding the LEDs just gave it a decent ambience for whenever we were watching anything, so be it movies, sports or TV series. This particular setup stayed for a little while, but the biggest sort of drawback on this setup was the audio. So this particular TV had a built-in soundbar, and whilst I would say the sound was quite loud for what it was, and it wasn't necessarily that bad, but even in comparison to the old LG speakers, which were obviously a lot chunkier TVs, it was quite tinny, and especially during movies, we found that despite having the bigger screen, we didn't actually enjoy watching movies on this particular setup that much. That's when the sort of Black Friday sales came about, and I found a deal on a LG soundbar. When I went in for the soundbar, I just wanted something that was future-proof, so I went for Dolby Atmos. At the time, this was basically the best that I could get for this price point, so it wasn't that expensive. I think it was around about the $650 mark, and basically what I was getting was at this time, it was a 7.1.2 setup alongside the rear speakers. Initially, I did set it up without the rear speakers, but basically you just got no rear surround experience from that. I don't know whether it's just my room, but I just didn't get any rear sound from the main soundbar itself. these additional speakers, even though they were quite small, they worked off this sort of link box, and they put out, I'd say, a little bit of important sound. So it was only in certain content where you would actually get anything coming from those rear speakers, and because they were passive, essentially that box was doing all the work. The soundbar itself was only ARC at this point. It wasn't an EOX soundbar, but for everything I needed, it basically did the job. It did come with a subwoofer. I believe this is a 7 or an 8-inch subwoofer built into this enclosure, and it did a good enough job in terms of filling the room with some bass, depending on how you had it set up. Now that I've upgraded the audio, at this point the TCL picture was really starting to bother me, so this is where I invested in OLED, and basically I just decided to go all out and get the very best picture type that I could actually find in terms of picture quality. So the option at this stage was either go really big and stick to LED, or fix the biggest concern that I had with the LED TVs, which was backlight, and go for something that just has the most vibrant picture I've ever seen. And that's basically what I opted to do. So I went for the OLED TV. It is ridiculously thin, so much so that I actually dislike this design feature, because it makes it very difficult to actually move this particular TV around. But the image that you got from it was basically the best that I've ever seen on a TV. The blacks were just pure black. Every color and every sort of light that came off that as a result just popped so much that it made content really enjoyable. And this sort of setup was something where it made me a lot more into watching movies and TV series in this particular room. In the past, we weren't really that bothered. Depending on which room we were in, we'd watch it wherever. But as soon as I upgraded to this setup, this is when initially I started thinking, yeah, everything I want to watch that is of importance, where we want to actually concentrate, I want to do it in this room, as opposed to just doing it in any of the rooms where there is a TV, because at this point I did have TVs in 3 different rooms. Ironically, this was actually when my channel actually first started, when I started making videos about the OLED TV, and that's basically where this whole thing sort of kicked on from. One of the other reasons I opted for OLED was because of gaming as well. At this point, as you can see in my media cabinet, I had the PS4 Pro, and my son was basically this is all during lockdown, and everybody's at home. We'd basically watched all the content that we could watch, and my son was just spending hours and hours on this set now, gaming. He had previously done it on the TCL TV, but the very first time he actually used it on this set, the first thing that he actually said to me was how much faster everything felt. And this is when he could actually enjoy gaming, because input lag wasn't really a factor anymore. The whole room aesthetic started to come along, so I added a few more LEDs. The LifeX bulbs were there from the start, so it meant that we could get this sort of a vibe going on in the room whenever I had any type of YouTube videos to film, or just generally to make it look cool, basically. It wasn't bad. This whole setup was a really good setup, and I did enjoy this. But even at the time, I remember thinking that because of the price point, and because at that time the 77-inch, I believe, was the biggest size you could have got anyway, it wasn't available in the UK at the time when I actually purchased this one. The 65 was the biggest I could get, and that's the one that I opted for. But as you can see, against that back wall, it does kind of look very small, so you're looking at the image rather than in the image, if that makes sense. But the fact that you had such a vibrant and impactful image from the TV, even with all of this ambient light. I mean, those LEDs are quite bright, and obviously the ceiling light that I've got set to blue. Right now, the image that you're seeing essentially coming from the TV, it's fighting all of that ambient light. And obviously a lot of people made comments about OLED TVs, the fact that they're not as bright as LED TVs, but realistically speaking, whenever you're in any type of a darkroom setup, you're not going to want anything that is much brighter than this, because it will actually hurt your eyes. I mean, this image right now, as you can see, every color, every image is just popping off the screen, and this is whilst it's fighting ambient light. Yes, in direct sunlight you do get a lot of glare simply because of the type of the finish on the panel, but that also meant that you did get a very sharp and impactful image when everything was set up and tuned. So then you had a dark room environment, or a dark room environment, because obviously at this point my walls were still white. Anyway, so coming back on to the sort of home theater, so at this point I have a 7.1.2 setup for the audio, and I have a 65-inch OLED TV. Now at this point, the biggest sort of factor that was still bugging me, and the thing that I wanted to upgrade the most, was Atmos. So the Atmos wasn't the best on the SL10YG, simply because you only had front Atmos speakers, and that's when I actually found a really good deal where because I had credit with my Amazon account, and because I managed to actually sell the SL10YG for pretty much what I bought the SN11RG for during a Black Friday sale, essentially I upgraded for free and ended up with a much better sound system. So at this point, once this was actually set up, I ended up with a 7.1.4 setup. Now the bass is still less than what I would have wanted, simply because of the balance. So I always have to choose whether I have the sub at the front or the back of the room, whereas ideally you would want a 7.2.4 at the least, simply because it'll help balance out the sub and help those frequencies actually bounce around the room in the way that you want them, so you're not getting a very front heavy bass stage, and you don't get as much of that reverb that way either. You'll get a lot more tactile bass. The soundbars themselves basically were identical. There was a few internal changes. So the old one was just ARC port, the new one was eARC. That was one of the reasons I actually upgraded, because that way I could actually connect a lot more ARC devices, or a lot more devices, either to the TV or to the soundbar. I had the option where it didn't drop off in quality. The rear speakers were also significantly bigger, so as you can see, those previous ones were quite small because they are passive, and then the little box that came with it, that was basically doing all the processing, and that in itself wasn't that powerful. With the SN11RG soundbar and rear speaker kit, the rears are as powerful as the fronts, which means that once you get it set up correctly, you don't get that drop off, or you're not having to increase the gain on the rears as much. If anything, with the setup I've got now, with the SN11RG, the rears are generally turned down further than the fronts are. So the gain, the sound output, and obviously the fact that you've got the extra two speakers, the extra two channels, if you like, upward firing speakers on the rear, meant that the Atmos experience using the SN11RG was a lot better, or is a lot better. I did do a video at the time, and I did do a sound comparison as well. Now, when I initially did the very first sound comparison, I still had the SL10 set up in the sort of positions it was meant to be. So the rears were on the wall, the soundbar was in its position, and when I basically tested the SN11 soundbar, the rears were set up in a way where I matched up what I had done with the SL10. Now that was a mistake at the time, because the Atmos speakers and the chunkier speakers on the newer soundbar meant that you did have to place them lower in order to get the best sound out of them. So unlike the small passive speakers that I had before, the powered, or the mains powered speakers for the rear now, ideally you want them at ear level, not above as I had previously, because previously they were kind of adding some of the height channel as well, so your rears were kind of filling in some of that space, whereas once you've got actual Atmos speakers in the rear speakers, you want to give them space to actually work. And that was the mistake that I actually made during the sound test comparison, and probably the reason why most people commented saying they actually preferred the SL10. The volume and everything, the gain and everything wasn't quite set up. It was literally just a quick test I did like this when I actually had everything set up at the same time, bearing in mind that I'd already pretty much found a buyer for the SL10, so at this point it was literally just a case of film whatever content I could, and then the buyer was going to come and collect. But as you can see, the rear speakers now, not only are the drivers bigger and the enclosure bigger, but you actually have these angled upward firing speakers, and that's something that you didn't have on the SL10YG. So once this is all fully set up, and you do have the option of the room optimization as well. Personally, I don't actually use that, simply because I find that it tends to kill the bass quite a bit. So for anyone else out there that's got the same setup and they find that after running it, basically your bass is just non-existent, you might want to actually remove that and just run it without the optimization. But yeah, once this was dialed in and everything, and obviously right now I've got it all set up in the similar way, because I've not got the soundbar on the media cabinet anymore, but once dialed in, this setup was, or is, significantly better. The rears are significantly more powerful, and they actually do a really good job in actually filling in some of the side surround as well, because the side surrounds on the soundbar itself, obviously they're angle speakers, and once again, my room isn't ideal because the walls are quite close, which means the first reflection point probably isn't where the side surrounds want it to be. But that does mean that now that with these new rear speakers, I do actually get a decent fill, and when I'm sat in my seating position, generally I do find that it feels like you're in the middle of the sound, as opposed to it just being either in front of you or behind you, depending on how you actually set up the gain on your speakers. And in this little clip here, it just shows you the difference with the ports. So as you can see, this one now does have the eARC ports on the newer soundbar, which does give me a lot more flexibility in the future depending on devices. So I can either connect devices directly to the soundbar, as I do with my Apple TV, or if I want to, I can actually connect them to the TV or any future setup, and then have it link back down via eARC, and not lose out on that better quality audio. Okay, and that brings us on to the biggest upgrade and the biggest change for my home theatre. And this is the first point I've actually started calling it a home theatre as opposed to being a media room, and that is the Hisense L9G, and in particular the 120 L9G. So this is a 120-inch projection from a DLP projector. This is a tri-laser projector, which means it actually covers 107% of the BT 2020 color space, which no TV on the market, apart from probably reference monitors, can actually reproduce. No consumer TV can actually reproduce that. It just means that I've now, for the first point, actually ended up with a home theatre, something where no matter where you're sat, you've got a fully immersive screen. And the one thing that I was debating when I was actually looking at this was whether I could live with the raised blacks. Obviously, coming from OLED, it was the worst case scenario where you're going from perfect blacks up to raised blacks, because no DLP projector will ever be able to match even some of the better projectors, let alone OLED. But before I actually made this purchase, I did actually, we went to the cinemas had reopened by this time, and I watched quite a lot of different movies, and I watched them on basically the best screens that were available in my local cinema. And even in those, there were raised blacks, but the thing that actually dawned on me was the reason you don't necessarily care is because the picture is so big and so immersive that you kind of forget about it. And that's basically what's ended up. The picture is so big and so immersive that you don't necessarily care about the raised blacks as much. The audio system got moved around a little. The rears stayed exactly as they were. The sub got relocated to that corner. Occasionally I do move it into the middle of the room, but generally it just stays in that corner. But what it has done is it's given a wall-to-wall screen now, and it's the first time you can sit anywhere in this room and not have to look at, but rather into a window, and it's almost as though you're there with the content itself. People are almost life-sized, which makes it a lot more immersive when you're watching any type of content. The media cabinet did stay for now, but this may get changed somewhere down the line, as and when any future upgrades for audio equipment actually come about. When watching movies, it's really immersive. The experience is so much better, and the one thing I don't find myself doing is ever moving my seating position any closer than where it is right now. At the moment I have the seating just push forward slightly just to give some separation between the rear speakers and my seating position, but it's essentially the perfect setup at the moment. If anything, I could probably do with actually going slightly further back, but as it is, it's still just about within that sort of sweet spot where I personally like being closer to the screen. So it's a little higher than I would have liked, but that's just one of these sort of downfalls of using ultra short throw technology, because you do have to have a certain distance or a certain gap between the bottom of the screen and where the actual projector is itself. Okay, so that's my journey up to this point. There will no doubt be upgrades and changes further down the line, so if you haven't already done so, please do subscribe and also hit the notification bell so you don't miss out on any future videos, and I'd really appreciate it if you also give this video a thumbs up. And until the next one, thanks very much for watching.